The lights of Graceland had dimmed to a low golden hush, and only the soft hum of the night filled the halls. On the piano his fingers rested, not moving, not yet. For a moment, Elvis Presley just stared at the keys like they held a memory he was afraid to touch. Then he played. A single note at first, deep and low, the kind that settles somewhere behind your ribs before you even know you've heard it. The melody was slow, almost cautious, like he was reaching for something just out of reach. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Priscilla stopped at the edge of the hallway, listening. She knew that sound. It wasn't the Elvis the world knew, not the one who made a crowd scream, not the man in gold who moved like lightning. This was something different, bare, haunted. There was no stage here, no band, no audience, just a man and a piano and a truth he couldn't say out loud. For weeks he'd been restless. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, packing those halls with a cigarette burning low between his fingers. Everyone noticed, but no one dared ask. When Priscilla did, he'd smile, that half smile, the one that hid more than it revealed, and say, "Just trying to remember something I can't forget." Tonight she realized what he meant. The song started to take shape. A few chords she'd never heard before, strung together like they were telling their own story. There was a sadness in it, yes, but also something pure, almost tender. She leaned closer, her breath catching when she recognized her own name whispered under his breath between verses. He didn't know she was there. And for a moment, she didn't want him to. She wanted to hear it as he meant it, unfiltered, unguarded. Because somewhere in that song, she could feel all the things he'd never said. The promises that had faded, the nights he came home too late, the quiet guilt he carried when the world demanded more of him than he could give. But this was his way of saying what words never could. His voice rose, soft but raw, breaking on one line, a single line that would stay with her forever. "I can't forget the sound of your goodbye." She felt her chest tighten, the way he sang it, not angry, not pleading, just tired, like a man singing to a ghost that was still alive. She thought back to the first time she ever heard him sing just for her. Germany, 1959. A borrowed piano, a small room that smelled like cigarettes and cold rain. He was barely 24 then, too famous for his own good, too lonely to admit it. She was 14, wide-eyed and trembling, trying to act older than she was. He looked up at her and smiled like she was the calm after a storm. That night he'd played "Are You Lonesome Tonight" before the world ever heard it. Said he liked the words, said they felt like a prayer. She never forgot that. Now, years later, the man at the piano didn't sound like the boy from Germany. There was an ache in his voice that time had carved out. She wanted to step closer to let him know she was there, but she couldn't, because she could tell deep down this song wasn't for her anymore, it was about her. He hit the next chord harder, then softer. The rhythm kept changing as if he was fighting with the melody itself. He'd stop, stare into space, and start again, changing a line, twisting a word. He was rewriting their story in real time. Every verse pulled her backward, to the nights she waited for him to come home from Hollywood, the mornings she found him still awake, eyes red from whatever pills kept him standing. The laughter that had once filled their rooms now replaced by quiet misunderstandings and the sound of the world pulling them apart. Still she stayed, because love to her wasn't about leaving when things got hard. It was about remembering why you came in the first place. Downstairs, Elvis played a bridge that sounded almost like hope. It rose and fell, trembling, then lingered on a single unresolved note. She knew his music well enough to feel what was missing, one word, one thought, one confession he couldn't finish. He looked up toward the ceiling as if searching for something. Then he whispered, barely audible, "For you, Scylla, always for you." She closed her eyes. The sound hit her harder than any lyric ever could. People thought they knew him, the man who gave everything on stage, who smiled for the cameras, who turned every heartbreak into gold. But the truth was, Elvis Presley lived between the songs. The quiet moments no one saw, the nights he'd play until dawn, chasing a feeling he could never quite hold on to. That night was one of them. Priscilla stepped back into the shadow. She didn't want to break the spell. The house was still, the melody echoing softly off the walls. She thought about how far they'd come from that army base in Germany to this mansion filled with everything except peace. Maybe, she thought, this was his way of saying goodbye before either of them were ready to. Elvis pressed his fingers down for the final note and held it there, letting it fade until all that remained was silence. He sat motionless for a long time, head bowed. Then, almost like a prayer, he whispered, "That's the one." She wanted to ask the one what, but she didn't, because in her heart she already knew. He stood, closed the piano lid gently, and walked out without looking her way. She stayed where she was, listening to the echo of that last note until it disappeared into the dark. Later, lying in bed, she tried to sleep, but the melody wouldn't leave her. It played in her mind over and over, like the sound of a memory refusing to die. She didn't realize it then, but that was the night Elvis began writing what he would later call his favorite song. The one he never performed live. The one that only a handful of people would ever hear. The one that captured not fame or glory, but love in its most fragile form. The next morning she asked him about it. He shrugged, pouring coffee like nothing had happened. "Just something I've been fooling around with," he said, his voice casual but eyes distant. "Ain't nothing yet." But there was something in the way he avoided her gaze, like a man guarding a secret too personal to explain. He'd always done that, hidden behind jokes, behind that southern charm that made the world adore him. To her, it was both beautiful and unbearable, because she knew that when Elvis hurt, he didn't cry, he wrote. And when he loved, he didn't say it, he sang it. As the day went on, he disappeared into the studio out back. The door stayed locked for hours. All she could hear was the faint strumming of a guitar, the occasional sound of him humming half-formed lyrics. When he finally came out, the sun was setting. He looked calm again, lighter somehow, like he'd made peace with something. She smiled at him, trying to read his face. "You finished that song." He grinned faintly, "Almost, but some things ain't meant to be finished, darlin', some just stay open." He kissed her forehead and walked past her toward the porch. She stood there a long time, his words circling her mind like smoke. Some things stay open. That was Elvis, always half here, half somewhere else. That night he played the song again, slower this time, almost whispering it into the air. She sat nearby, unseen again, just listening. Each note felt like a heartbeat, fragile, imperfect, but alive. He didn't write it down, didn't record it properly, just played it until the lines blurred between the man and the music. And maybe that's why it became his favorite, because it wasn't meant for the world. It was a memory-turned melody, a confession wrapped in sound. Years later, she would think back to that night and realize something she couldn't have known then. That song was the beginning of their ending. The moment when love shifted from something shared to something remembered. But in that moment, she didn't feel loss. She just felt awe, standing at the doorway, watching the man the world called a king pour his heart into a piano like a child trying to make sense of heartbreak. And though she couldn't see his face, she knew he was crying. Not loud, not broken, just quiet tears that no one would ever talk about. When he finally stopped playing, he said softly, "Funny thing about music, it don't lie, even when you wish it would." Then he smiled, that same weary smile that had carried him through 1,000 stages, and walked away again. The room stayed heavy with the sound of what he'd left behind. And Priscilla, she just stood there, realizing that for the first time in their years together, she'd heard the truth, not in his words, not in his promises, but in the music. That night would haunt her for decades, because in those few minutes at the piano, she saw the man behind the myth, and she understood that every lyric he ever sang about love, loss, and redemption began right there with that song. A song no one else would ever fully hear. The night a song changed everything. And she never forgot the sound of it. He first saw her through a clouded window in a house full of laughter and uniforms. It was 1959, and West Germany was painted in shades of gray, cold, disciplined, and far from anything that felt like home. Elvis Presley had been drafted, stripped of stardom, living like any other soldier. But that night, when someone mentioned a young American girl downstairs, curiosity got the better of him. When she walked in, the noise in the room faded. She was just 14, trying to look older than she was, but her eyes carried something rare, innocence without fear. Elvis smiled, half amused, half undone. "Well, who do we have here?" he said softly, and for reasons she couldn't explain, her heart stumbled. That first night stretched long past midnight. He played songs no one else had ever heard. Old gospel hymns, unfinished melodies, bits of country tunes that seemed to float somewhere between prayer and confession. She sat near him, silent, memorizing every movement. When he sang softly, she felt like he was pulling her into a secret no one else could touch. By the time her father's car pulled up outside, the stars had shifted. She went home dizzy with wonder, a 14-year-old girl who'd met a man the world called a king, but who had spoken to her like she was the only person in the room. He called 2 days later, and again a week after that, then every chance he got. Elvis's army days were a strange blur of discipline and isolation. To the world, he was a soldier. In truth, he was a caged performer. He'd lost his mother only months before leaving for Germany, and the ache of that loss lingered like smoke. Priscilla's letters became a balm. Her words were clumsy but warm. They gave him something to look forward to in a place where everything felt mechanical. When he played for her again, she said quietly, "It sounds like home." He looked up, surprised. "That's the nicest thing anyone's ever told me." In that dim living room, between borrowed furniture and the hum of an old record player, something impossible began. A man searching for solace. A girl searching for meaning. But behind the sweetness, something darker brewed. Even then, Elvis had begun using pills, little white promises of energy and peace. His friends laughed it off, said it kept him going. But Priscilla noticed the shadows in his eyes, the way his hands sometimes trembled between chords. She didn't understand addiction, she just thought he carried too much sadness. And then one evening, after he walked her home under a fatting German sky, he stopped at her gate. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This," he said, "is a promise." On the page, a few lines of handwritten lyrics, words that didn't rhyme, not yet, a love song half finished. He told her one day he'd turn it into music, "when I know what it really means." She didn't know it then, but that note would follow them for the rest of their lives. When he left Germany, she stood at the base gate in tears, watching his car disappear into the distance. He pressed his hand to the window, mouthing the same words he'd written, "I'll finish the song." Years passed before she saw him again. By the time she stepped into Graceland, she was 17, older but still holding the same letter. Elvis was a star again, larger than life. The mansion buzzed with laughter, music, and strangers who treated him like royalty. But beneath the glamour, she could feel it, the loneliness had only deepened. Their first night together in Memphis didn't feel like a reunion. It felt like stepping into a dream that had been waiting too long. He held her hand like he was afraid she'd vanish. And for a while, she forgot the world outside. He played for her again, same melody still unfinished, but now there was a new verse, darker, desperate. She asked him why he never recorded it. He smiled sadly. "Because some songs ain't meant to be sold." That line stayed with her. She tried to build a normal life around his chaos. High school by day, Graceland by night. The lights, the noise, the endless stream of fans who called him a god. But when the doors closed, he was just a man who couldn't sleep, who took pills to wake up and pills to dream. He'd look at her sometimes, eyes soft, and ask, "You happy, Scylla?" She'd nod, though she wasn't sure what happiness meant anymore. One night, after another argument about his late nights and phone calls from women whose names she didn't recognize, she found herself in the music room. On the piano, a sheet of paper, the same old song. Only now, a new line was scribbled across the margin. "I built a dream I can't live in." She stared at it for a long time, realizing it wasn't just a lyric. It was a confession. He found her there, holding the paper. Instead of anger, he looked almost relieved. "I guess you were meant to see that," he said, then quietly, "I don't always know how to be me." That was Elvis, always fighting the distance between the man and the myth. Their nights became a pattern, brief laughter, long silences, apologies whispered over half-written songs. He tell her stories from Germany, from before the fame, from when life was simpler. Sometimes, after the house had gone still, he'd pull out that same melody and play it again, slower now, weighted with years of regret. Every time she heard it, the promise he made in Germany echoed louder, "I'll finish the song." But deep down, she began to wonder if he ever would. Because each time he touched the piano, she saw how much it cost him, how the notes carried pieces of him he couldn't recover. The melody became a mirror, showing both of them what they'd lost along the way. By 1962, Priscilla felt trapped between two worlds, the young girl who believed in the dream and the woman realizing what the dream demanded. Her parents worried, friends whispered, newspapers speculated, but she stayed. Because when he looked at her, even for a moment, she saw the same boy from Germany, lonely, tender, reaching for something real. He gave her the song one night, folded neatly into an envelope. "Keep it safe," he said. "It's still missing something." She asked what. He hesitated, eyes distant, "Maybe time." And then he smiled, that weary smile that always meant goodbye, even when he didn't say the word. The years ahead would be louder, brighter, and far more cruel. But she'd hold onto that melody, those scribbled words, and that night under the German stars when a young man with a heavy heart promised her something he never stopped chasing. Because in the end, that song wasn't just about love. It was about truth, the kind of truth he couldn't say out loud. And as fame consumed him, and the world began to see only the legend, Priscilla carried the memory of the boy who'd written a promise on a piece of paper and called it music. The vow he made in a quiet corner of West Germany had never left him. It would shape his heart, his choices, and every line he ever wrote after. And one day, long after the crowd stopped cheering, she'd realize what the song had been about all along, not her, not fame, but the moment he'd found someone who saw through the armor. The song was never finished, because maybe it wasn't meant to be. He said it best himself years later, starring at the same yellowed page. You don't finish something that still keeps you alive. That was Elvis, the boy who turned promises into melodies, the man who wrote love like a wound that refused to heal. And every time Priscilla heard that faint melody drift through the walls of Graceland, she'd remember not the star, not the scandal, but the lonely soldier in Germany who once whispered a promise beneath the same moon they both grew old under. The promise that became a song, and the song that became his secret. He stared at the blank page for hours, pen tapping against the desk, the faint hum of a television somewhere in the background. The headlines were still buzzing, Elvis and Anne Margaret, inseparable on set. He'd told Priscilla it was all gossip, just another story, but deep down he knew the truth wasn't that simple. Hollywood had a way of blurring lines between truth and image, between love and performance. Anne was wild, fiery, the kind of woman who could match his rhythm on stage and laugh in the same language of chaos. Priscilla was the opposite, gentle, patient, the quiet anchor he didn't deserve. And yet, every time he picked up his guitar, it was her face he saw. That conflict lived inside him. He'd begun writing the song again, the same one from Germany, only now it sounded different, rougher, more wounded. He changed the chords, darker now, fewer major notes. The old melody of longing had turned into something heavier, something that trembled with guilt. At night, he'd play it softly, thinking she couldn't hear. But Priscilla always did. The way he sang certain lines, I built a dream I can't live in, felt like a mirror she didn't want to look into. The press stories about Anne Margaret grew louder. The phone calls more frequent. And with every denial, the distance between them grew wider. She tried to believe him. She told herself fame did this to people. It created versions of you that didn't really exist. But when he came home late one night, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers, she knew the silence between them had become its own language. He saw the look in her eyes and without saying a word walked to the piano. He started playing the song again. This time he didn't hide it. His voice cracked. She stood in the doorway, the same spot she'd stood years later when that song would return to haunt her, and listened. Each verse sounded like a confession. Each pause an apology. When he reached the end, he didn't turn around. He just said quietly, some songs tell on you, baby. That night she cried alone, not from anger but from something harder, understanding. Because deep down she knew he didn't want to hurt her. He was just lost, trapped between who the world wanted him to be and who he used to be. The next morning she found a note on the kitchen table, just 4 words, it's still your song. But that wasn't true anymore. The melody had changed. The promise from Germany, pure, unbroken, had been rewritten in the ink of exhaustion. Through the mid-60s, fame demanded everything. Movies, tour, appearances, endless scripts. He started to believe that the music wasn't his anymore, that he was just a product wrapped in rhinestones. Every time he felt that way, he turned back to the song. It became his refuge, his journal. Some nights he'd pour bourbon, sit at the piano, and start to rewrite it again. Always the same opening line, always the same middle verse. But he kept changing the ending. First it said, you saved me. Then you forgave me. Later still, you left me. It was like he couldn't decide what story he was really telling, the one he wished for or the one he lived. Meanwhile, Priscilla waited, the quiet shadow behind the myth. When he was home, he was tender, even playful. When he wasn't, she'd receive flowers or cryptic letters signed with drawings instead of words. She'd show them to her friends and smile like things were perfect, but inside she felt the distance stretching like a thin wire. And the pills, they became part of him. He'd say they helped him keep pace. But she saw what they did, how they dulled his eyes, how they made his laughter hollow. Sometimes he'd promise to stop, but the next night the small bottles would find their way back onto the bedside table. Through it all, that song kept growing. It became a diary written in melody. He started calling it the one that won't quit. One evening, after a long shoot in Los Angeles, he came home restless. Couldn't sleep, couldn't sit still. Priscilla asked what was wrong. He said he'd seen Anne again just for a few minutes and it had stirred something he thought he'd buried. She didn't speak, just turned away, tears welling. He followed her to the hallway, grabbed her hand gently and whispered, "It ain't what you think. She was the spark, but you're the fire." It should have comforted her, but it only deepened the ache. Because even if he meant it, part of him was always somewhere else, lost in the glitter and loneliness of the life he'd built. That night he picked up his notebook again. He crossed out the old title and wrote a new one. When the music forgets the man. No one knew that was what he called it then. No one ever would. But for him, it captured everything: the fame that devoured his soul, the love that softened it, and the song that refused to leave him alone. Months later, Priscilla stumbled upon another draft in his drawer. The lyrics were the same until the final verse. There, one word had changed, a single devastating alteration. The old line, "I still believe in you." The new one, "I can't believe in me." That was the night she realized Elvis wasn't writing about their love anymore. He was writing about himself. Every performance, every forced smile, every sleepless night, it all lived in that one change. He wasn't just confessing, he was unraveling. And yet, every time he sang, every time he wrote, he seemed almost at peace, as if music was the only place he could tell the truth. In 1968, the year Lisa Marie was born, something shifted. Holding that baby in his arms, he felt a kind of purity he hadn't known in years. He played the song one last time, that summer, slow and tender, replacing the bitterness with something gentler. Priscilla asked him if he'd ever record it. He smiled faintly. "Nah, some songs are too real for radio." She laughed through tears, not realizing he meant it. Because he never did record it. He kept it to himself, a secret melody that only surfaced when the weight of fame grew too heavy. But even as their marriage began to fracture, the song lingered between them. When words failed, it spoke for them. When anger rose, it softened. It became both bridge and wound. By 1970, the world saw a comeback star, leather suits, roaring crowds, the king reborn, but Priscilla saw something different. The way his eyes searched the crowd for meaning, the way his hands trembled when the lights dimmed. He finish a show, drenched in applause, and whisper under his breath, "It still don't feel like mine." One night after another exhausting performance, he returned to his room and played that same melody, the one he'd written for her all those years ago. His voice was lower now, rawer, but the heart of it was the same. She stood quietly at the door, just like before, listening. He finished the song, exhaled slowly, and said, "That's the truth right there." She asked, "What truth?" He looked at her and said, "That love and music, they both break you if you do 'em right." She never forgot that lines. It was the last time she ever heard him play it all the way through. After that, he changed again, more restless, more haunted. The fame that had once seemed like salvation now felt like a curse. The late nights turned into endless mornings. The laughter became forced. And every time she looked at him, she could still hear the song playing behind his eyes, the one he'd never let the world hear. Because that melody was no longer about her or even about love. It was about the cost of being Elvis Presley. Years later, after everything had fallen apart, she would remember that night, the tremor in his hands, the half-finished lyric, the way he looked at her like she was both the reason and the remedy for his pain. And she would finally understand what he'd meant all those years ago in Germany, when he promised to finish the song. He did finish it, just not the way either of them expected. He finished it with every choice, every heartbreak, every night he stood under the lights pretending he was still whole. That was his confession, not written, not recorded, but lived. The song he couldn't let go of. And the one that, in the end, couldn't let go of him. He woke up before dawn, the world still hushed outside Graceland's gates. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, leaving the air heavy and clean. On the piano near the window, the old sheet of paper waited, creased, yellowing, edges curled like it had survived too much. It was the song. The same one that had followed him through years of chaos, headlines, stages, and sleepless nights. He sat down quietly. His hands trembled before they even touched the keys. For a moment, he just stared at the empty house, at the faint reflection of himself in the window. The man who once owned the world now looked like a shadow searching for its body. When he began to play, it wasn't with energy or perfection. It was with surrender. Soft, uneven, fragile. Each note carried the weight of a memory: Germany, the promise, the wedding, Lisa Marie's first cry, the empty seats after the lights went out. All of it lived in that melody. Someone else was listening that morning, one of his closest friends sitting just outside the doorway with a small recorder. He'd learned not to interrupt Elvis when he played alone. These moments were sacred, like watching a confession being whispered to heaven. The tape clicked on quietly. Elvis sang the first verse under his breath. Not quite words, more like prayers shaped into sound. His voice, though thinner now, carried something purer than it ever had before. There was no fame in it, no performance, just truth. Halfway through, he stopped, sighed, and started again. This time he changed a line, the one that had always haunted him. The lyric that once said, "I still believe in you," was now, "I forgive you." And in that moment, it wasn't just about Priscilla anymore. It was about everything: the fame, the pain, the years spent trying to live up to a name he never asked for. He finished the song with a quiet hum, pressing the last chord and letting it fade into the silence. Then he leaned back, eyes closed, and whispered to himself, "Now it's done." That was 3 days before his final performance in Indianapolis. People who were there said he looked tired, yet peaceful. When he walked on stage, the crowd erupted, but he didn't smile the way he used to. He scanned the room like a man looking for someone he knew he wouldn't find. He sang with everything he had left. His voice cracked in places, but it didn't matter. Every note sounded like a farewell wrapped in gratitude. When he finished, he looked up for a long moment, then said quietly into the mic, "Until we meet again, God bless you." Most thought it was just his way of closing the night, but those closest to him knew better. It sounded like goodbye. Back in Memphis, the tape of that private recording sat in a drawer, untouched. The friend who'd captured it didn't even tell Priscilla until years later. He said he didn't want to break the spell of it, that it felt like the kind of thing meant to stay hidden until the world was ready. When she finally heard it, her hands shook. It was a late summer evening. The house was quiet except for the soft hiss of the old cassette player. Then his voice, faint, cracked, yet impossibly alive, filled the room. She closed her eyes, and suddenly she was back in Germany, 14 again, watching him at the piano, believing in forever. Only now she could hear everything she'd missed before: the sadness beneath the melody, the forgiveness woven into every note. Halfway through, he whispered something she'd never known he recorded. Just 4 words, almost lost under the piano: "This one's for peace." That was when she cried. Not from pain, but from something gentler, the kind of sorrow that carries gratitude. Because she realized then, after all the years, all the chaos, all the headlines and heartbreak, the promise he made in 1959 had been kept. Not in the way she expected, but in the only way he could. He finished the song. Not for the world, not for fame, but for her, and for himself. After his passing, the recording stayed private for decades. A few insiders heard it, a raw, unfinished take with faint piano and the soft rasp of a man at peace. Some called it haunting, others called it holy. Priscilla called it the most honest thing he ever made. She never released it officially, said it wasn't meant to be heard by millions, said it belonged to the small corner of his heart that never left the boy he once was, the one who believed that love could survive distance, time, and even death. In later interviews, she was asked what Elvis's favorite song was. She smiled softly, never giving the real answer. "He had a lot of favorites," she'd say, "but there was one that wasn't for anyone else, just for us." And every time she said those words, she could still hear that faint melody drifting through her memory, fragile, timeless, unfinished. Years later, when she visited Graceland alone one evening, she walked into that same music room where it had all begun. The piano was still there, polished, untouched. She sat down, ran her hand across the keys, and smiled. The house felt full again. Because somewhere between those walls, his music still lived. And maybe that was the true meaning of legacy. Not the gold records, not the fame, but the quiet song that never stopped echoing through the heart of the one person who'd known the man behind the myth. For her, it wasn't about what the world remembered. It was about what the world never heard. The hidden recording. The final goodbye. The love story that turned into a melody, and the melody that became eternal. When she left the room, she turned back once, whispering into the still air, "You kept your promise, Elvis." Outside, the evening wind carried the faint sound of leaves brushing against the windows, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. And if you listened closely, it almost sounded like him. The man who turned his truth into a song. The man who loved too deeply to let the world hear it. The man who, even in silence, was still singing. The song never charted, never played on the radio, never made it onto any list of hits. But it was the truest thing he ever made. And though the world remembers him for 1,000 songs, she remembers him for one. The one he never let go of. The one that forgave them both. The one that changed everything. The song that never died. Maybe that's the real story, not the fame, not the fall, but the promise. The one whispered between two people who grew up too fast and loved too hard. Because behind every headline and photograph, behind every echo of "Love Me Tender," there was a melody no one else heard, the sound of a man trying to say "I'm sorry" and "thank you" in the same breath. And maybe that's why his music still moves people, because somewhere in every note there's truth. Imperfect, fragile, beautiful truth. The kind only someone who's lived through both heaven and heartbreak could ever sing. Because sometimes the songs the world never hears are the ones that never stop playing.